In the medieval mind, the convent was imagined as a fortress of holiness, a sanctuary where women withdrew from the world, their lives devoted to God behind stone cloisters and vows of silence. But the historical record, stretching from Yorkshire to Rome, paints a more complicated picture. Life behind the veil was not always a perfect reflection of the ideal. Not every woman who entered the cloister left the world behind in spirit. At the very core of convent life stood strict and unyielding order. Caesarius of Alls, writing around the year 512, described nuns as the gems of the church, hidden away to protect them from the spiritual wolves prowling beyond the walls. His regula virginum prescribed their lives with almost military precision. They were to rise before the first light for prayer, wear modest dress without a trace of vanity, avoid gossip, eat meager meals, and move quietly through their narrow world. Quick question before we go further. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. It's fascinating to see how many different places are joining in to uncover this hidden side of history. This enclosure was more than just stone walls. It was a spiritual discipline, a lifelong vow of separation. But ideals have a way of colliding with reality. Over time, some houses of religion began to slip into disorder. By 1298, Pope Boniface VIII issued the Decree Periculoso, demanding that all nuns remain perpetually enclosed. The language was blunt. Nuns were to be protected from occasions for lasciviousness, their nunnish modesty guarded at all costs. It was a command meant to defend virtue, against temptation, against scandal, and perhaps against something that was already quietly taking root. Because hidden behind the silence of cloistered walls, forbidden things did sometimes unfold. Take the notorious case of the Wotton Priory in 12th century Yorkshire. According to Ellard of Rievaulx, one young nun went out a virgin of Christ and soon returned an adulteress. She had taken a lover, likely a lay brother, and became pregnant. What followed was a story of punishment, escape, and ultimately a kind of redemption. Ellard recorded it not simply as a cautionary tale, but as a miracle, proof that even those who strayed could find forgiveness. But the story also revealed just how thin the line was between sanctity and human desire. And in some places, that line snapped completely. At Littlemore Priory in 16th century England, scandal erupted. When ecclesiastical investigators arrived in 1517, they uncovered a torrent of violations. The prioress, Catherine Wells, had borne a child with the convent chaplain, and even used church funds to pay the dowry. The house was in chaos. Some nuns were thrown into stocks, others rebelled openly. One even set fire to her way out, escaping in a blaze of defiance. Another confessed, "I am ashamed to be here under the evil rule of my lady." These were not whispered rumors or gossip traded in alehouses. They were official records, transcribed and filed as comperta, the formal findings of church visitation. And yet, even amid such disorder, convent life continued. Psalms were still sung at dawn, manuscripts copied in scriptoria, bread baked in stone ovens. Most nuns did not break their vows, but those who did often did so quietly, under cover of darkness, in locked rooms, or through secret letters passed between iron grills. Because life behind the veil was never purely about holiness. It was about power, control over space, over thought, over the female body. And wherever control is strictest, resistance is always close behind. Which brings us to one of the most haunting aspects of convent history: the secret punishments that took place when resistance was discovered. A woman vanishes from her convent in the dead of night. No crowd witnesses her departure. No chronicler records her fate. Only a single note in a legal roll, taken by persons unknown. What happened before she disappeared is left unwritten. And it is there, in that silence, that the shadow of the convent dungeon begins to emerge. Because while convents were built as places of prayer and peace, they could just as easily become places of discipline and fear, where transgression, whether real or imagined, was met not with public trial, but with secret correction. The same walls that were meant to shelter virtue could just as easily conceal coercion. In 1304, at the Benedictine Priory of Clementhorpe in Yorkshire, a nun named Cecilia was taken away in the night. The record is brief and chilling. She was removed, along with certain goods, the perpetrators unnamed. 2 years later, at the Cistercian convent of Kirklees, another woman, Elizabeth de Hopton, was seized under similar circumstances. The entries in the King's Justice Rolls are so terse that they raise more questions than they answer. These were not the words used for lovers' elopements. They suggest something darker, more official, perhaps a covert abduction sanctioned by authority. And one must wonder, were these women truly kidnapped? Or were they being dragged back to some secret cell, punished for trying to escape imprisonment within? Centuries later, the mythos of the convent dungeon would explode into the public imagination with awful disclosures. 1836, a lurid and sensational work by Maria Monk. But even before the Victorian era gave these tales their melodramatic spin, the shadow of what might have happened in those locked chambers still lingers in the historical record. A reminder that sanctity and secrecy often walked hand in hand. She claimed that within the walls of a Canadian convent, women were not merely cloistered, they were imprisoned. According to her account, nuns were dragged into underground chambers, tried in secret, silenced, and erased from memory. Her testimony was vivid, almost theatrical, and it set the public imagination on fire. Readers were horrified and fascinated, fueling a wave of anti-Catholic fear that swept across 19th century North America. Eventually, her book was widely discredited, dismissed as fabrication. But the power it held, the way it lingered in the public mind, reveals something deeper, a lasting suspicion that what happened behind cloistered doors could never be fully known. Modern historians warn us not to confuse the mythical oubliette, a dungeon of no return, with the lived realities of convent discipline. But the idea persists almost stubbornly. Even today, the thought of secret confinement in religious life continues to haunt us, sitting right at the uneasy crossroads between piety and power. The truth is complicated. Many convents had no dungeons at all. They were simply houses of prayer, quiet and austere. Yet others, especially those backed by wealthy patrons or powerful bishops, may have had hidden rooms. Not grand torture chambers, but private cells used for discipline, for forced silence, or simply to make someone disappear. The hair shearing ritual, a sentence written on the body. Picture this. A woman kneels in perfect stillness. Her head is bowed. The room is silent except for the scrape of metal. Then, in a single deliberate stroke, the shears pass across her scalp, stripping away not just her hair, but her dignity, her status, and a piece of her very identity. In the medieval imagination, to cut a woman's hair was never just a change of style. It was a statement. Sometimes it was sacred, a ritual of dedication, but in other cases, it was a punishment, a spectacle meant to humiliate. Hair was more than ornament. It was a living symbol. Among Frankish royalty, uncut hair signified dynastic power. To shear a prince's locks was to strip him of the right to rule. And in the quiet halls of the convent, scissors and shears carried a similar weight. The Merovingian chronicles tell of royal women entering religious life through the ceremonial cutting of their hair. In one account, a mother, surrendering her worldly ambitions for her daughter, took iron shears into her own hands and shaped her child's hair into a crown of sanctity. In this form, the ritual was not disgrace, but a gift, a setting apart of the girl as a bride of Christ. But in other contexts, the gesture darkened. Ecclesiastical records and legal codes tell us that hair shearing was sometimes used as punishment. A nun who had violated her vows, whether through sexual scandal or open rebellion, might be forcibly tonsured, her hair cut not in a holy rite but as an act of public shame. The same tool that could sanctify could just as easily degrade. This punishment echoes across the wider medieval world. In secular law, adulterous wives could be forced to appear in public with their hair shorn or disheveled, a walking proclamation of their moral failure. What was once a symbol of feminine honor became a billboard of dishonor, a spectacle for all to see. Yet even here, the meaning was layered. In the early Christian church, tonsure, the shaving of the crown, was considered sacred, the double crown of devotion, marking monks and nuns as belonging to Christ alone. And so a paradox emerges. The very same blade could either sanctify or humiliate, bless or condemn, depending entirely on who held it and why. In the end, the hair that fell to the stone floor was never just hair. It was a sign of control over the body, over the soul, and over the narrative of the person it once belonged to. And once it was gone, it never quite grew back with the same meaning. Across centuries, the convent was more than a sanctuary. It was a battleground, a place where obedience and resistance clashed, where silence could be either holy or forced, where sacred rituals could double as punishment. The veil, the stocks, the shears, these were not just symbols of faith. They were instruments of authority, tools that could decide the fate of a single woman, and in doing so, quietly shape the moral imagination of entire societies. These rituals didn't just discipline the body. They erased stories, rewrote history, and kept entire lives hidden in silence. So, how should we read this history today, when the very gestures of devotion, shaving the head, locking the door, enforcing the vow, could also serve as weapons of control? Where do we draw the line between sanctity and suppression? Was the convent truly a sanctuary for the devout, or was it a gilded cage meant to keep women in their place? Tell me what you think in the comments. Was it safety, sacrifice, or silent imprisonment? I love hearing how you all interpret these moments in history. And remember the words of Pope Boniface VIII, who in 1298 decreed that nuns must remain perpetually cloistered, that their hearts and bodies might be safeguarded in perfect chastity. But when walls are built too high, devotion can turn into isolation, and faith can begin to feel like a prison. If you enjoy diving into these forgotten corners of the past, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this video. It helps grow our little community here at Vassal Truths, where we uncover the secrets and struggles history tried to bury. Stay curious, because the past still has so many whispers left to tell.